ghost story to you from the book The Empty House and Other Ghost Stories by Algernon Blackwood. Today I will be reading The Strange Adventures of a Private Secretary in New York. But this is by far the longest story in this book. It is twice as long as any other. So, this video will be part 1, and the next 2 weeks I will upload parts 2 and 3. But anyway, let's get into it. Once again, this story is called The Strange Adventures of a Private Secretary in New York. It was never quite clear to me how Jim Shorthouse managed to get his private secretaryship, but once he got it, he kept it, and for some years he led a steady life and put money in the savings bank. One morning, his employer sent for him into the study, and it was evident to the secretary's trained senses that there was something unusual in the air. "Mr. Shorthouse," he began somewhat nervously, "I have never yet had the opportunity of observing whether or not you are possessed of personal courage." Shorthouse gasped, but he said nothing. He was growing accustomed to the eccentricities of his chief. Shorthouse was a Kentish man. Sidebotham was raised in Chicago. New York was the present place of residence. "But," the other continued, with a puff at his very black cigar, "I must consider myself a poor judge of human nature in future if it is not one of your strongest qualities." The private secretary made a foolish little bow in modest appreciation of so uncertain a compliment. Mr. Jonas B. Sidebotham watched him narrowly, as the novelists say, before he continued his remarks. "I have no doubt that you are a plucky fellow, and—" He hesitated and puffed at his cigar as if his life depended upon it keeping alight. "I don't think I'm afraid of anything in particular, sir, except women," interposed the young man, feeling that it was time for him to make an observation of some sort, but still quite in the dark as to his chief's purpose. "Humph," he grunted. "Well, there are no women in this case so far as I know, but there may be other things that hurt more." "Wants a special service of some kind, evidently," was the secretary's reflection. "Personal violence?" he asked aloud. "Possibly," puff. "In fact," puff puff, "probably." Shorthouse smelt an increase of salary in the air. It had a stimulating effect. "I've had some experience of that article, sir," he said shortly, "but I'm ready to undertake anything in reason." "I can't say how much reason or unreason there may prove to be in this particular case. It all depends." Mr. Sidebotham got up and locked the door of his study and drew down the blinds of both windows. Then he took a bunch of keys from his pocket and opened a black tin box. He ferreted about among blue and white papers for a few seconds, enveloping himself as he did so in a cloud of blue tobacco smoke. "I feel like a detective already," Shorthouse laughed. "Speak low, please," returned the other, glancing round the room. "We must observe the utmost secrecy. Perhaps you would be kind enough to close the registers," he went on in a still lower voice. "Open registers have betrayed conversations before now." Shorthouse began to enter into the spirit of the thing. across the room and shut the two iron gratings in the wall that in American houses supply hot air and are termed registers. Mr. Sidebotham had meanwhile found the paper he was looking for. He held it in front of him and tapped it once or twice with the back of his right hand, as if it were a stage letter and himself the villain of the melodrama. "This is a letter from Joel Garvey, my old partner," he said at length. "You have heard me speak of him." The other bowed. He knew that many years before Garvey and Sidebotham had been well known in the Chicago financial world. He knew that the amazing rapidity with which they accumulated a fortune had only been surpassed by the amazing rapidity with which they had immediately afterwards disappeared into space. He was further aware, his position afforded facilities, that each partner was still to some extent in the other's power, and that each wished most devoutly that the other would die. The sins of his employer's early years did not concern him, however. The man was kind and just, if eccentric, and Shorthouse, being in New York, did not probe to discover more particularly the sources whence his salary was so regularly paid. Moreover, the two men had grown to like each other, and there was a genuine feeling of trust and respect between them. "I hope it is a pleasant communication, sir," he said in a low voice. "Quite the reverse," returned the other, fingering the paper nervously as he stood in front of the fire. "Blackmail, I suppose." "Precisely." Mr. Sidebotham's cigar was not burning well. He struck a match and applied it to the uneven edge, and presently his voice spoke through clouds of wreathing smoke. "There are valuable papers in my possession bearing his signature. I cannot inform you of their nature, but they are extremely valuable to me. They belong, as a matter of fact, to Garvey as much as to me, only I've got them." "I see." "Garvey writes that he wants to have his signature removed, wants to cut it out with his own hand. He gives reasons which incline me to consider his request." "And you would like me to take him the papers and see that he does it?" "And bring them back again with you," he whispered, screwing up his eyes into a shrewd grimace. "And bring them back again with me," repeated the secretary. "I understand perfectly." Shorthouse knew from unfortunate experience more than a little of the horrors of blackmail. The pressure Garvey was bringing to bear upon his old enemy must be exceedingly strong. That was quite clear. At the same time, the commission that was being entrusted to him seemed somewhat quixotic in its nature. He had already enjoyed more than one experience of his employer's eccentricity, and he now caught himself wondering whether this same eccentricity did not sometimes go further than eccentricity. "I cannot read the letter to you," Mr. Sidebotham was explaining, "but I shall give it into your hands. It will prove that you are my accredited representative. I shall also ask you not to read the package of papers. The signature in question you will find, of course, on the last page at the bottom." There was a pause of several minutes, during which the end of the cigar glowed eloquently. "Circumstances compel me," he went on at length, almost in a whisper, "or I should never do this. But you understand, of course, the thing is a ruse. Cutting out the signature is a mere pretense. It is nothing. What Garvey wants are the papers themselves." The confidence reposed in the private secretary was not misplaced. Shorthouse was as faithful to Mr. Sidebotham as a man ought to be to the wife that loves him. The commission itself seemed very simple. Garvey lived in solitude in the remote part of Long Island. Shorthouse was to take the papers to him, witnessing the cutting out of the signature, and to be specially on his guard against any attempt, forcible or otherwise, to gain possession of them. It seemed to him a somewhat ludicrous adventure, but he did not know all the facts and perhaps was not the best judge. The two men talked in low voices for another hour, at the end of which Mr. Sidebotham drew up the blinds, opened the registers, and unlocked the door. Shorthouse rose to go. His pockets were stuffed with papers and his head with instructions, but when he reached the door he hesitated and turned. "Well," said his chief. Shorthouse looked him straight in the eye and said nothing. "The personal violence, I suppose," said the other. Shorthouse bowed. "I have not seen Garvey for 20 years, he said. "All I can tell you is that I believe him to be occasionally of unsound mind. I have heard strange rumors. He lives alone, and in his lucid intervals studies chemistry. It was always a hobby of his. But the chances are 20-1 against his attempting violence. I only wished to warn you, in case. So that you may be on the watch." He handed his secretary a Smith & Wesson revolver as he spoke. Shorthouse slipped it into his hip pocket and went out of the room. A drizzling, cold rain was falling on fields covered with half-melted snow when Shorthouse stood, late in the afternoon, on the platform of the lonely little Long Island station and watched the train he had just left vanish into the distance. It was a bleak country that Joel Garvey, Esquire, formerly of Chicago, had chosen for his residence, and on this particular afternoon it presented a more than usually dismal appearance. An expanse of flat fields covered with dirty snow stretched away on all sides, till the sky dropped down to meet them. Only occasional farm buildings broke the monotony, and the road wound along muddy lanes and beneath dripping trees swathed in the cold raw fog that swept in like a pall at the dead from the sea. It was 6 miles from the station to Garvey's house, and the driver of the rickety buggy Shorthouse had found at the station was not communicative. Between the dreary landscape and the drearier driver, he fell back upon his own thoughts, which, but for the spice of adventure that was promised, would themselves have been even drearier than either. He made up his mind that he would waste no time over the transaction. The moment the signature was cut out, he would pack up and be off. The last train back to Brooklyn was 7:15, and he would have to walk the 6 miles of mud and snow, for the driver of the buggy had refused point-blank to wait for him. For purposes of safety, Shorthouse had done what he flattered himself was rather a clever thing. He had made up a second packet of papers identical in outside appearance with the first. The inscription, the blue envelope, the red elastic band, and even a blot in the lower left-hand corner had been exactly reproduced. Inside, of course, were only sheets of blank paper. It was his intention to change the packets and to let Garvey see him put the sham one into the bag. In case of violence, the bag would be the point of attack, and he intended to lock it and throw away the key. Before it could be forced open and the deception discovered, there would be time to increase his chances of escape with the real packet. It was 5 o'clock when the silent Jehu pulled up in front of a half-broken gate and pointed with his whip to a house that stood in its grounds among trees and was just visible in the gathering gloom. Shorthouse told him to drive up to the front door, but the man refused running no risks," he said. "I've got a family." The cryptic remark was not encouraging, but Shorthouse did not pause to decipher it. He paid the man and then pushed open the rickety old gate swinging on a single hinge and proceeded to walk up the drive that lay dark between close-standing trees. The house soon came into full view. It was tall and square and had once evidently been white, but now the walls were covered with dirty patches and there were wide yellow streaks where the plaster had fallen away. The windows stared black and uncompromising into the night. The garden was overgrown with weeds and long grass, standing up in ugly patches beneath their burden of wet snow. Complete silence reigned over all. There was not a sign of life. Not even a dog barked. Only, in the distance, the wheels of the retreating carriage could be heard growing fainter and fainter. As he stood in the porch, between pillars of rotting wood, listening to the rain dripping from the roof into the puddles of slushy snow, he was conscious of a sensation of utter desertion and loneliness, such as he had never before experienced. The forbidding aspect of the house had the immediate effect of lowering his spirits. It might well have been the abode of monsters or demons in a child's wonder tale, creatures that only dared to come out under cover of darkness. He groped for the bell handle or knocker, and finding neither, he raised his stick and beat a loud tattoo on the door. The sound echoed away in an empty space on the other side, and the wind moaned past him between the pillars as if startled at his audacity. But there was no sound of approaching footsteps, and no one came to open the door. Again he beat a tattoo, louder and longer than the first one, and, having done so, waited with his back to the house and stared across the unkempt garden into the fast gathering shadows. Then he turned suddenly and saw that the door was standing ajar. It had been quietly opened, and a pair of eyes were peering at him round the edge. There was no light in the hall beyond, and he could only just make out the shape of a dim human face. "Does Mr. Garvey live here?" he asked in a firm voice. "Who are you?" came in a man's tones. "I'm Mr. Sidebotham's private secretary. I wish to see Mr. Garvey on important business." "Are you expected?" "I suppose so," he said impatiently, thrusting a card through the opening. "Please take my name to him at once, and say I come from Mr. Sidebotham on the matter Mr. Garvey wrote about." The man took the card, and the face vanished into the darkness, leaving Shorthouse standing in the cold porch with mingled feelings of impatience and dismay. The door, he now noticed for the first time, was on a chain and could not open more than a few inches, but it was the manner of his reception that caused uneasy reflections to stir within him, reflections that continued for some minutes before they were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and the flicker of a light in the hall. The next instant the chain fell with a rattle, and gripping his bag tightly, he walked into a large, ill-smelling hall, of which he could only just see the ceiling. There was no light but the nickering taper held by the man, and by its uncertain glimmer Shorthouse turned to examine him. He saw an undersized man of middle age with brilliant, shifting eyes, a curling black beard, and a nose that at once proclaimed him a Jew. His shoulders were bent, and, as he watched him replacing the chain, he saw that he wore a peculiar black gown like a priest's cassock, reaching to the feet. It was altogether a lugubrious figure of a man, sinister and funereal, yet it seemed in perfect harmony with the general character of its surroundings. The hall was devoid of furniture of any kind, and against the dingy walls stood rows of old picture frames, empty and disordered, and odd-looking bits of woodwork that appeared doubly fantastic as their shadows danced queerly over the floor in the shifting light. "If you'll come this way, Mr. Garvey will see you presently," said the Jew gruffly, crossing the floor and shielding the taper with a bony hand. He never once raised his eyes above the level of the visitor's waistcoat, and, to Shorthouse, he somehow suggested a figure from the dead rather than a man of flesh and blood. The hall smelt decidedly ill. All the more surprising, then, was the scene that met his eyes when the Jew opened the door at the further end, and he entered a room brilliantly lit with swinging lamps, and furnished with a degree of taste and comfort that amounted to luxury. The walls were lined with handsomely bound books, and armchairs were arranged round a large mahogany desk in the middle of the room. A bright fire burned in the grate, and neatly framed photographs of men and women stood on the mantelpiece on either side of an elaborately carved clock. French windows that opened like doors were partially concealed by warm red curtains, and on a sideboard against the wall stood decanters and glasses with several boxes of cigars piled on top of one another. There was a pleasant odor of tobacco about the room. Indeed, it was in such glowing contrast to the chilly poverty of the hall that Shorthouse already was conscious of a distinct rise in the thermometer of his spirits. Then he turned and saw the Jew standing in the doorway with his eyes fixed upon him, somewhere about the middle button of his waistcoat. He presented a strangely repulsive appearance that somehow could not be attributed to any particular detail, and the secretary associated him in his mind with a monstrous black bird of prey more than anything else. "My time is short," he said abruptly. "I hope Mr. Garvey will not keep me waiting." A strange flicker of a smile appeared on the Jew's ugly face and vanished as quickly as it came. He made a sort of deprecating bow by way of reply. Then he blew out the taper and went out, closing the door noiselessly behind him. Shorthouse was alone. He felt relieved. There was an air of obsequious insolence about the old Jew that was very offensive. He began to take note of his surroundings. He was evidently in the library of the house, for the walls were covered with books almost up to the ceiling. There was no room for pictures. Nothing but the shining backs of well-bound volumes looked down upon him. 4 brilliant lights hung from the ceiling, and a reading lamp with a polished reflector stood among the disordered masses of papers on the desk. The lamp was not lit, but when Shorthouse put his hand upon it, he found it was warm. The room had evidently only just been vacated. Apart from the testimony of the lamp, however, he had already felt, without being able to give a reason for it, that the room had been occupied a few moments before he entered. The atmosphere over the desk seemed to retain the disturbing influence of a human being, an influence, moreover, so recent that he felt as if the cause of it were still in his immediate neighborhood. It was difficult to realize that he was quite alone in the room, and that somebody was not in hiding. The finer counterparts of his senses warned him to act as if he were being observed. He was dimly conscious of a desire to fidget and look round, to keep his eyes in every part of the room at once, and to conduct himself generally as if he were the object of careful human observation. cause of these sensations it is impossible to say, but they were sufficiently marked to prevent his carrying out a strong inclination to get up and make a search of the room. He sat quite still, staring alternately at the backs of the books and at the red curtains, wondering all the time if he was really being watched, or if it was only the imagination playing tricks with him. A full quarter of an hour passed, and then 20 rows of volumes suddenly shifted out towards him, and he saw that a door had opened in the wall opposite. The books were only sham backs after all, and when they moved back again with the sliding door, Shorthouse saw the figure of Joel Garvey standing before him. Surprise almost took his breath away. He had expected to see an unpleasant, even a vicious apparition with the mark of the beast unmistakably upon its face, but he was wholly unprepared for the elderly, tall, fine-looking man who stood in front of him, well-groomed, refined, vigorous, with a lofty forehead, clear gray eyes, and a hooked nose dominating a clean-shaven mouth and chin of considerable character. A distinguished-looking man altogether. "I'm afraid I've kept you waiting, Mr. Shorthouse," he said in a pleasant voice, but with no trace of a smile in the mouth or eyes. "But the fact is, you know, I've a mania for chemistry, and just when you were announced I was at the most critical moment of a problem, and was really compelled to bring it to a conclusion." Shorthouse had risen to meet him, but the other motioned him to resume his seat. It was borne in upon him irresistibly that Mr. Joel Garvey, for reasons best known to himself, was deliberately lying, and he could not help wondering at the necessity for such an elaborate misrepresentation. He took off his overcoat and sat down. "I've no doubt, too, that the door startled you," Garvey went on, evidently reading something of his guest's feelings in his face. "You probably had not suspected it. It leads into my little laboratory. Chemistry is an absorbing study to me, and I spend most of my time there." Mr. Garvey moved up to the armchair on the opposite side of the fireplace and sat down. Shorthouse made appropriate answers to these remarks, but his mind was really engaged in taking stock of Mr. Sidebotham's old-time partner. So far there was no sign of mental irregularity, and there was certainly nothing about him to suggest violent wrongdoing or coarseness of living. On the whole, Mr. Sidebotham's secretary was most pleasantly surprised, and, wishing to conclude his business as speedily as possible, he made a motion towards the bag for the purpose of opening it, when his companion interrupted him quickly. "You are Mr. Sidebotham's private secretary, are you not?" he asked. Shorthouse replied that he was. "Mr. Sidebotham," he went on to explain, "has entrusted me with the papers in the case, and I have the honor to return to you your letter of a week ago." He handed the letter to Garvey, who took it without a word, and deliberately placed it in the fire. He was not aware that the secretary was ignorant of its contents, yet his face betrayed no signs of feeling. Shorthouse noticed, however, that his eyes never left the fire until the last morsel had been consumed. Then he looked up and said, "You are familiar, then, with the facts of this most peculiar case?" Shorthouse saw no reason to confess his ignorance. "I have all the papers, Mr. Garvey," he replied, taking them out of the bag, "and I should be very glad if we could transact our business as speedily as possible. If you will cut out your signature, "One moment, please," interrupted the other. "I must, before we proceed further, consult some papers in my laboratory. If you will allow me to leave you alone a few minutes for this purpose, we can conclude the whole matter in a very short time." Shorthouse did not approve of this further delay, but he had no option then to acquiesce, and when Garvey had left the room by the private door, he sat and waited with the papers papers in his hand. The minutes went by, and the other did not return. To pass the time, he thought of taking the false packet from his coat to see that the papers were in order, and the move was indeed almost completed when something, he never knew what, warned him to desist. The feeling again came over him that he was being watched, and he leaned back in his chair with the bag on his knees and waited with considerable impatience for the other's return. For more than 20 minutes he waited, and when at length the door opened and Garvey appeared, with profuse apologies for the delay, he saw by the clock that only a few minutes still remained of the time he had allowed himself to catch the last train. "Now I am completely at your service," he said pleasantly. "You must, of course, know, Mr. Shorthouse, that one cannot be too careful in matters of this kind, especially," he went on, speaking very slowly and impressively, "in dealing with a man like my former partner, whose mind, as you doubtless may have discovered, is at times very sadly affected." Shorthouse made no reply to this. He felt that the other was watching him as a cat watches a mouse. "It is almost a wonder to me," Garvey added, "that he is still at large. Unless he has greatly improved, it can hardly be safe for those who are closely associated with him." The other began to feel uncomfortable. Either this was the other side of the story, or it was the first signs of mental irresponsibility. "All business matters of importance require the utmost care, in my opinion, Mr. Garvey," he said at length, cautiously. "Ah, then, as I thought, you have had a great deal to put up with from him," Garvey said, with his eyes fixed on his companion's face. "And, no doubt, he is still as bitter against me as he was years ago when the disease first showed itself." Although this last remark was a deliberate question, and the questioner was waiting with fixed eyes for an answer, Shorthouse elected to take no notice of it. Without a word, he pulled the elastic band from the blue envelope with a snap, and plainly showed his desire to conclude the business as soon as possible. The tendency on the other's part to delay did not suit him at all. "But never personal violence, I trust, Mr. Shorthouse," he added. "Never." "I'm glad to hear it," Garvey said in a sympathetic voice. "Very glad to hear it. And now," he went on, "if you are ready, we can transact this little matter of business before dinner. It will only take a moment." He drew a chair up to the desk and sat down, taking a pair of scissors from a drawer. His companion approached him with the papers in his hand, unfolding them as he came. Garvey at once took them from him, and after turning over a few pages, he stopped and cut out a piece of writing at the bottom of the last sheet, but one. Holding it up to him, Shorthouse read the words "Joel Garvey" in faded ink. "There, that's my signature," he said, "and I've cut it out. It must be nearly 20 years since I wrote it, and now I'm going to burn it." He went to the fire and stooped over to burn the little slip of paper, and while he watched it being consumed, Shorthouse put the real papers in his pocket and slipped the imitation ones into the bag. Garvey turned just in time to see this latter movement. "I'm putting the papers back," Shorthouse said quietly. "You've done with them, I think." "Certainly," he replied as, completely deceived, he saw the blue envelope disappear into the black bag and watched Shorthouse turn the key. "They no longer have the slightest interest for me." As he spoke, he moved over to the sideboard, and pouring himself out a small glass of whiskey, asked his visitor if he might do the same for him. But the visitor declined and was already putting on his overcoat when Garvey turned with genuine surprise on his face. "You surely are not going back to New York tonight, Mr. Shorthouse," he said in a voice of astonishment. "I've just time to catch the 7:15 if I'm quick." "But I never heard of such a thing," Garvey said. "Of course I took it for granted that that you would stay the night. It's kind of you, said Shorthouse, but really I must return tonight. I never expected to stay. The two men stood facing each other. Garvey pulled out his watch. I'm exceedingly sorry, he said, but upon my word, I took it for granted you would stay. I ought to have said so long ago. I'm such a lonely fellow and so little accustomed to visitors that I fear I forgot my manners altogether. But in any case, Mr. Shorthouse, you cannot catch the 7:15, for it's already after 6 o'clock, and that's the last train tonight. Garvey spoke very quickly, almost eagerly, but his voice sounded genuine. There's time if I walk quickly, said the young man with decision, moving towards the door. He glanced at his watch as he went. Hitherto he had gone by the clock on the mantelpiece. To his dismay he saw that it was, as his host had said, long after 6. The clock was half an hour slow, and he realized at once that it was no longer possible to catch the train. Had the hands of the clock been moved back intentionally? Had he been purposely detained? Unpleasant thoughts flashed into his brain and made him hesitate before taking the next step. His employer's warning rang in his ears. The alternative was 6 miles along a lonely road in the dark, or a night under Garvey's roof. The former seemed a direct invitation to catastrophe, if catastrophe there was planned to be. The latter, well, the choice was certainly small. One thing, however, he realized was plain. He must show neither fear nor hesitancy. My watch must have gained, he observed quietly, turning the hands back without looking up. It seems I have certainly missed that train and shall be obliged to throw myself upon your hospitality. But, believe me, I had no intention of putting you out to any such extent. I'm delighted, the other said. Defer to the judgment of an older man and make yourself comfortable for the night. There's a bitter storm outside, and you don't put me out at all. On the contrary, it's a great pleasure. I have so little contact with the outside world that it's really a godsend to have you. The man's face changed as he spoke. His manner was cordial and sincere. Shorthouse began to feel ashamed of his doubts and to read between the lines of his employer's warning. He took off his coat, and the two men moved to the armchairs beside the fire. You see, Garvey went on in a lowered voice, I understand your hesitancy perfectly. I didn't know Sidebotham all those years without knowing a good deal about him, perhaps more than you do. I've no doubt now he filled your mind with all sorts of nonsense about me, probably told you that I was the greatest villain unhung, and all that sort of thing. Poor fellow. He was a fine sort before his mind became unhinged. One of his fancies used to be that everybody else was insane, or just about to become insane. Is he still as bad as that? Few men, replied Shorthouse with the manner of making a great confidence, but entirely refusing to be drawn, go through his experiences and reach his age without entertaining delusions of one kind or another. Perfectly true, said Garvey. Your observation is evidently keen. Very keen indeed, Shorthouse replied, taking his cue neatly. But, of course, there are some things, and here he looked cautiously over his shoulder. There are some things one cannot talk about too circumspectly. I understand perfectly and respect your reserve. There was a little more conversation, and then Garvey got up and excused himself on the plea of superintending the preparation of the bedroom. It's quite an event to have a visitor in the house, and I want to make you as comfortable as possible, he said. Marks will do better for a little supervision. And, he added with a laugh as he stood in the doorway, I want you to carry back a good account to Sidebotham.